Every leader has a strategy. Executing on that strategy is the challenge. If you want to learn how to effectively achieve what you've set out to accomplish, then this show is for you. Gain keen insights and listen in as leaders share their stories and challenges. Soar Vision Group and the Baldrige Foundation welcome you to Leader Dialogue Radio.
Hello and welcome to Leader Dialogue, brought to you by Soar Vision Group and the Baldrige Foundation. I'm Mike Salmon, sitting in today for Duffy Dixon, and joining me is Ben Sawyer. He's the Chief Executive Officer of Soar Vision Group. Ben has more than 30 years of executive leadership experience. He launched Soar Vision Group to help align people with purpose and to achieve exceptional results. Also joining us today is Lisa Counsell, the Chief Commercial Officer with Sawyer Vision Group. Lisa has over 20 years of clinical leadership and clinical informatics experience. She spent 19 years at the McKesson Corporation. Our special guest today is Dr. George Benson, the Professor of Decision Sciences at the College of Charleston. He currently serves as the Baldrige Foundation's Chairman of the Board, in addition to serving on the Board of Directors for 3 public companies, AGCO, Crawford & Company, and Primerica. Dr. Benson graduated from Bucknell University with a bachelor's degree in mathematics. He did graduate work at New York University and earned a doctorate in decision sciences from the University of Florida. He taught in the Carlson School of Management at the University of Minnesota, served as the Dean of the Rutgers Business School at Rutgers University, and as Dean of the Terry College of Business at the University of Georgia, prior to serving 8 years as the President of the College of Charleston, where he continues to teach statistics. Dr. Benson, thank you for joining us here today in the studio.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Do you prefer that we refer to you as Dr. Benson or George? What's your preference?
George is fine.
George is great.
Absolutely.
Okay, so George, Ben, and Lisa. So for the listeners, it is really an honor to have George Benson on the show today because he has a significant history with the Baldrige, and as you can tell from his credentials, is a very well-educated and experienced executive. So George, welcome. And we want to just start by understanding your background with the Baldrige and then get into sort of your perspective on that.
Well, my background with the Baldrige began in the 1990s, but I actually have to go back farther than that. If I go back to the 1960s, my father was a professor of statistics at Bucknell.
Oh, okay.
My first statistics course was from him.
Interesting.
And that was the first time I saw anything like statistical process control.
Yeah.
And so that was my first flavor or touch into the world of quality and so forth. I moved on to a master's program at New York University and there studied statistical process control again, and eventually on to the University of Florida in the PhD program. Yes, I was in the business school, but my minors were statistics and economics.
Wow.
So all of that was the background that led me to the University of Minnesota as a professor for 16 years. That's where it really caught on fire. That's where I really got interested in Baldrige and in quality management, quality control, and so forth.
So how did the statistics and decision sciences lens help provide insight for you as it related to the power and efficacy of the Baldrige?
My background was, when you say statistics, you're talking basically data analysis,
right,
if you will. So data is at the core of virtually everything I did. All the statistical methods that I learned and I applied, whether it was through consulting or teaching in the classroom, was all about data.
Right.
And data is at the core,
right,
of quality and quality management and performance excellence.
Right.
At the core, period.
Yep.
So that's where it started. But what happened was in 1970, the United States, 1970s, the United States sort of woke up all of a sudden and realized, oh my gosh, the products coming out of Japan are superior to ours. The
right,
electronic products, the
right,
automobiles, the televisions, and so forth. What happened? Because when I was a kid growing up back in the 50s, you didn't want to buy anything that said made in Japan because the quality
right,
was horrible.
Yeah.
So what happened was people like Ed Deming, one of the so-called quality gurus, Joe Duran, another quality guru, had gone over to Japan and taught them statistical process control and other quality management methods. Japanese got ahead of us. So we woke up. So it's while I'm a professor, the country is coming awake. The Western world is starting to wake up. This quality revolution sweeps across the world. And I'm seeing this. And here I am with my skills in statistics and data analysis. And it looked interesting. So I dove right in. Now, Baldrige didn't come around until 1987, 1988, but it was launched because we were behind, try to make us more competitive, try to make us more efficient, try to produce higher quality products, make us a more competitive marketplace for the world here in the United States.
So President Reagan became interested in American exceptionalism. This would have been in the late 80s, right?
Yes.
And Malcolm Baldrige was the Secretary of Commerce at the time. So were you exposed to how the genesis of the Baldrige then, based upon that timeline?
I was exposed to it initially through reading, just kind of seeing it emerge, if you will, in the newspaper or a little bit on television. But I also was connected to Ed Deming. I had gone to one of his 4-day seminars in the mid-'80s. Then eventually he invited me to speak at one of his 4-day seminars in
That's awesome.
1990.
Wow. That's
so
great.
I got an opportunity to be around him and get to know him a little bit. Also had a little time with Joe Duran, also with Bill Golomsky. Now, Bill Golomsky was president of the American Society for Quality. He was one of the first members of the panel of judges back at the very beginning. So Bill was a consultant from Chicago. He also taught at the University of Chicago. I saw a lot of him in the late 80s. So as he went into and got involved with Baldrige, I heard a lot of it from him. That was how
you were getting
really
exposed.
right on the
you were getting
Yes.
exposed and interacting with
onset.
the leaders of the whole quality movement worldwide. That's an amazing background.
And they were, those guys were called gurus at the time.
Yeah.
They were right at the focal point. Also, you had, besides Deming and Duran, you also had Phil Crosby. Those were three. And I was fortunate enough at the University of Minnesota to be able to interact with all of them. Also, at that period of time, Kurt Ryman. Kurt was the first director of the Baldrige Program. I spent time with Kurt at the University of Minnesota. So all of these people who were involved with the very beginnings of this movement, if you will, I was fortunate enough to have access to.
That's a great story.
That is absolutely amazing. So for the listeners, you are listening to
History.
an executive who has been and an educator who has been a part of the Baldrige from its very origins and source. So again, we're really privileged to have you on the show today, George. This is amazing. So that helps answer the question sort of your background and connection to the Baldrige. Then you saw the Baldrige evolve. So it was housed under NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology. Talk to the audience a little bit about the evolution of it and kind of where it is now from your perspective.
Well, and then my direct involvement with Baldrige, one day in about 1996, I got a call from Harry Hertz. Harry was the second director and longtime director of the program, and he's still involved with us and the Baldrige Foundation. So I see Harry quite regularly. He called and invited me to be a member of the panel of judges. So we had 9 national judges for the award, and I, of course, said yes as fast as I could. And that's how I got involved and sort of could see it then from the inside. That work then, after finishing up 3 years of that, then I was invited to join the Board of Overseers for the Baldrige Program and did that for a 3-year term. In the last 2 years, I was chairman of the Board of Overseers.
And this is at NIST.
This is right. This board really reports to the Secretary of Commerce.
Right.
And it's looking out for the national interest. Is the Baldrige Program working in the national interest? Are there things it could do to improve? So every year we reported out to the Secretary of Commerce. When I finished that 3-year term, I was then invited to join the Baldrige Foundation Board in about 2007, I think it was. And I've been on the Foundation Board since then. And I've been the chairman of that board for the last 7 years. So the award has evolved over time. It started out at just sort of three categories. You had service, small business, and manufacturing were the categories of the economy in which you could receive or win a Baldrige Award. But the thing to remember as we talk about the Baldrige Award, it's really not just an award program. It's really an educational program.
For sure, process.
And what all the award does is it identifies role model organizations that can be held up for other people to learn to learn from. And so they are then required to share with other firms after they receive the award. So the Baldrige Program over the years then evolved on from those first 3 categories, service, small business, and manufacturing, to education, healthcare, and nonprofits / government. So that covers now the entire economy. And Baldrige has a Baldrige Excellence Framework, which is a criteria of something like 370 questions that gives people a systems approach to managing the performance of their organization. And that criteria is evaluated and revised, tweaked every other year, every 2 years, basically. So that's another way that it has evolved over time, some of the changes in there. If you look at the first set of criteria versus the first set of criteria were not all questions. There were some questions, but there were more statements. Mm-hmm. Then it eventually was revised so that it's all questions now. So it's easier to access. You can pick it up and dive right into a particular area, leadership, for example, or strategy, and pull out questions that can help you, whether mm-hmm. you're on a board of directors, whether you are the leader of the organization, whether you're a mid-level manager, whether you're somebody working on the floor. It's accessible through those questions.
And again, for the listeners, this has been going on now for 30 plus years.
Right? Yep.
And so there's been this very arduous refinement and application of the Baldrige to all these cross-sector industries.
Yes.
With remarkable outcomes for those who are national Baldrige winners. Correct?
Yes, no question. Their performance has been documented. It's significantly better than organizations in the same competitive fields that have not followed the Baldrige approach. So it has been very beneficial to the country as a whole, not just to the individual organizations that are pursuing a Baldrige journey. It's helping our whole marketplace.
So the logical question for the listeners is, if it's so powerful and so comprehensive, why isn't everybody doing it?
That's a good question. And that might take me an hour or two to answer.
And even comparing to 1996 when you became really involved.
Yes.
Could you compare and contrast with Ben's question of why there aren't more organizations that are embracing, again, if they're outperforming, if winners are outperforming their competitors 5-1, some articles will say,
yes,
then why aren't they jumping on the bandwagon? You would just think they would all be, and again, it seems like there are less today than there were maybe in 1996. Is that a true statement?
I don't know.
Organizations pursuing?
There's no way to know how many organizations are actually pursuing it. We get applications to people who want to win regional awards or state awards or the national award, but I don't think we have an accounting of, and there's no way we could know,
Gotcha.
all of the people that are actually following the Baldrige approach. But
so let me ask,
it's thousands of organizations.
Right.
I don't know how many
so
thousands.
let me ask the question this way, baby, for the benefit of the listener. From your perspective, what have been some of the obstacles for broad adoption?
Yes. I think one of the obstacles has to do with the length of the document, the length of the Baldrige Framework, the Excellence Framework itself. It's 50-some pages long and has 370 questions in it. So it's a lot. It's fairly detailed, but it needs to have that sort of detail. So there have been some other introductions developed over time. We have a Baldrige Excellence Builder now that the Baldrige Program has turned out, which is a much shorter version, but that's only been out for a few years. I use that in the classroom, for example. I use that to introduce freshmen, sophomores, juniors in college to the Baldrige Program. Much more accessible than is the full set of criteria. That's one aspect. Another aspect is the Baldrige gives you the framework gives you a systems approach to managing the performance of your organization. It lets you assess sort of how you're doing. It lets you identify gaps or issues where maybe you should be doing strategic planning, but you're not doing strategic planning. Maybe you should be sharing best practices across the organization, but you're not sharing best practices across the organization. You can identify those kinds of issues. But what the Baldrige Program doesn't do is then tell you how to fix that. Mm-hmm. How do you fill that gap? It's not prescriptive. Mm-hmm. So some people will learn from the framework, and you can learn a lot from the framework. It's well worth getting involved for a number of years. But then, as you want to start solving some of those problems, you have to get in contact with experts, consultants, academics, others that may, examiners that have worked in the Baldrige Program for years. There are lots of people out there you can call on to help. But the Baldrige Program itself doesn't provide prescriptions. And it's one of the things, it's one of the changes I would like to see.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and so the economy obviously has been evolving significantly over the last 30 years, and the pace of change is dramatically different with the advent of digital technology and essentially global competition and so forth. So, for example, Baldrige journeys in the past for national award winners will take sometimes between 10 and 12 years. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right.
And so now when you have CEO life cycles being maybe 3 years or thereabouts, that could essentially be, 4 different CEOs.
That's exactly right.
Which is why those board members need to engage.
That's exactly right.
So let's dive into that a little bit. And if you're able to stay with us for our next week session 2 where we deep dive, we'll pick up on some of these themes.
Okay.
But specifically, I wanted to talk to you about continuity, using from a standpoint of the board, from an organization standpoint, and then also accelerants. So, for example, the listeners are used to us talking about visualization of the organizational hierarchy of needs connected to the category, so they can quickly visualize its connection and relevance.
Yes.
From the standpoint of structure, we've talked a little bit about our purpose-led strategy execution software that allows them to quickly integrate the various data sources and be able to manage their cascading scorecard simultaneously with their journey. All designed to accelerate. So the metaphor I would give is sort of like a builder. You can either write away for the blueprint and build your own house, or you can engage someone like you talked about that can basically frame it up for you. So all you're needed to do is make floor covering and wall covering decisions, that kind of thing, right? To be able to finish the house. So with that as a backdrop, help listeners understand in this age, what are some of the things that can be done to make the Baldrige more relevant and also speed the process along?
Right. Well, the 2 things that are on my agenda are prescription, to be involved more with how do we fill those gaps. I think we need to do that. And it doesn't necessarily have to be coming from the Baldrige program itself. It could be coming from the Baldrige Foundation, for example. We've just launched an Institute for Performance Excellence within the Baldrige Foundation, where we can become more prescriptive than the Baldrige program has been over the decades. That's one thing. Another thing is the involvement with boards of directors. The Baldrige program has not directly moved into that area of the organization. If you think of an organization, you can think of the oversight function, which is the board. You can think of the leadership function, which is sort of top management. You can think of the execution function, where things get done. Most of the people using the Baldrige criteria and the framework are in the execution part of the organization. These are mid-level managers and below. The framework was not really written in the language of senior executives, so it's not quite as accessible to them. And it's definitely not written in the language of governance, in the language of boards of directors. So when you see companies adopting the framework and using it for 3, 4, 5 years, and all of a sudden they shift, it could be because, guess what, the CEO retired. Or the CEO moved on to somewhere else. New CEO comes in and says, oh, you were following Baldrige. Well, I need to do it a different way. I need to do it my way.
Their own way.
I can't continue to do it.
They bring in their own. They bring in their own playbook.
They bring in their own playbook, exactly. So if the board were involved, they wouldn't be bringing in their own playbook. You'd have continuity from administration to administration if the board were involved with this. So 13, 14 years ago, Harry Hertz and I wrote a 2-pager about this to try to kind of get this process started within the Baldrige program, and it never really got very far. Well, I've kind of jumped back on the bandwagon, and I'm pushing as hard as I can now in my role in the Baldrige Foundation, not for the Baldrige program per se, but for the Baldrige Foundation to do more for boards of directors, make it accessible for boards of directors, write something in their language that they can work with to help with the oversight of performance management, which is their responsibility.
We do hear consistently CEOs say that finally make that connection. We wish we had engaged our board sooner. We wish that we'd, again, sooner and more broadly,
Yes.
right? Like not just a couple of board members, but the entire board.
That's right.
And get them committed to the process.
That's right. And an example of an organization that does that, and we may talk about this later, is Tata, which is a 700,000 people conglomerate based in India, but which includes Land Rover and Jaguar, and they've got Tetley Tea for the last 20 years, I believe, some names we know around
Wow.
here. Very big organization. Last time I looked, they were $103, $105 billion revenue.
That's big.
That's
That's
big.
big.
So it's a conglomerate of roughly 100 companies. 32 of them are traded publicly. The holding company is not traded publicly, Tata Sons. They have engaged their board. So before an assessment is done in their organization, the board is involved. The chairman is consulted. The chairman will point out areas of weakness or areas where he or she thinks they should focus. And so then they do their assessment of the organization, like we would do here in the United States with the Baldrige criteria. Oh, and by the way, they basically use the Baldrige criteria. They adopted it 25 years ago, and they are still using it. So you can't even use the Tata name in this conglomerate of 100 organizations unless you are following this performance excellence
So
model.
they attribute their sustainable success to the
Yes.
integration of the Baldrige principles in how they operate.
Yes, it gives them a kind of a glue that keeps these 100 organizations together. So, and because it's non-prescriptive, in this case it's an advantage. So you can get all 100 organizations, or a big chunk of them, using this without necessarily changing their culture and other things that are relevant for that particular organization. It gives them a common language. So the manager or CEO from one organization can talk to another, and they share best practices. They have something like 600 best practices across these organizations that are available to everybody in the organizations on a portal.
That's awesome.
So there is a balancing line sort of between overly prescriptive
Yes.
and helpfully prescriptive.
Yes.
So let me see if I, based on the conversation so far, can give examples for the listeners on both sides of that line. So, for example, what Dr. Deming did in Japan was provide statistical process control and
Yes.
continuous improvement. That would be an example of prescription, but it's not intrusive.
Right.
It is on the right side of the line. In
That's
other words,
right.
it's saying, okay, great, this is going to help us really improve.
That's right.
Something that may be overly prescriptive is you have to develop your strategy exactly this way, or this needs to be included in your strategy.
That would be overly prescriptive. That's correct.
Right,
That would
so-
turn a lot of people off, and it would go a different direction.
Right. So the benefit and power of the Baldrige all along is that it is applicable to any organization
Yes.
in any sector.
Any sector, any size.
And what you're really saying is that to be even more helpful, there are aspects on the right side of that prescriptive line
Yes.
that can provide tools and best practices and so forth for organizations to be able to actually accelerate
Yes.
their journey and to maybe get more dramatic results sooner.
Yes, and they could choose from among the ones they want to use. So it's not like the Baldrige Program or the foundation saying you got to use these. If you don't use these, you're going to go wrong. No, that's not it at all. The framework really opens the door. The framework opens your eyes. It allows you now to think of your organization as a whole. It's not just these subsets, these different divisions, these different business units, these different departments. You now can think of the whole organization. You think about it holistically. But then once you start thinking of it that way and managing it that way and identifying the gaps and problems, you want to be able to fill those gaps and get rid of those problems. And that requires some prescription. So yes, one way is to bring in consultants. Another way I'm suggesting is that the Baldrige Foundation could have a collection of tools and methods that are available for you to work with. And maybe what the foundation would do was specialize in 2 or 3. Maybe it's strategy, for example. And you really build up some expertise in strategy and make that available to the world, the way the framework was made available to the world. The framework, by the way, the Baldrige Excellence Framework, is used in over 120 countries around the world, with the best example being Tata in India.
Right.
25 years they've been using that now. That is absolutely
That's stunning.
astounding. they may be the best example in the world of the use of systems thinking.
And we could repurpose their 600 best practices in many organizations
Yes.
or a subset of those.
So what's
Absolutely.
interesting, and we're approaching towards the end of our session
Good
here.
gracious, time
I
flies.
know, time flies. So we're going to start pulling together some themes that we'll include in next week's
Sure.
deep dive. But one of the observations that I wanted to just connect the dots for the listeners on is SOAR is a partner of the Baldrige Foundation for that very
Yes.
purpose.
Yes.
The idea is to bring forward tools and capabilities to accelerate the journey through the focus on strategic priority and execution,
Yes.
to be able to help organizations be more successful and be able to accelerate what they do. And what you're saying is more of those kinds of things as they are put forward that actually can demonstrate success in the journeys
Yes.
should be explored.
Yes, and particularly one of those sorts of things for boards of directors.
Yes.
I mean, that is where the power of the organization lies. It's not with the CEO and senior management.
Right.
Governance is all about the distribution of power.
Right.
And the board decides where that power will reside.
Right.
And to leave them out of the chain of activities associated with performance excellence, to have them just sort of hovering over the top of it without really access to what's going on down below. Again, one of the great paradoxes of corporate governance is all of the power is based in the board, but all the information resides with management. And so
it's hard to execute effectively without that knowledge.
That's right.
Right? It's hard to oversee without that knowledge. It's hard to
Exactly.
manage without that knowledge.
Exactly.
So when we talk deep dive, we want to go back into that oversight, management, execution,
Yes.
and maybe provide some practical examples of what that would look like
Absolutely.
if it was done correctly.
Yeah, ironically enough, we did a CEO roundtable recently, and we invited their board members. We encouraged the CEOs to
Yes.
bring their board members. Very few did. It was very interesting how they just didn't want to invite them. And it was all, again, around governance discussion and Baldrige. It was
Yes.
kind of combined. And they didn't extend the invites to their board members.
And not only should the board be involved and really understand what's going on throughout the organization, the board has its own issues with organization performance management of itself. The board has
Right.
to also perform, and the board should be applying some of the Baldrige criteria to itself.
Right.
And we don't really have tools yet that enable boards to do that. You could hand them the 370 questions in 58 pages, but it's not written in the language of the board, so they're probably not going to use it.
Well, and the board is typically not full-time people. They are
They're
doing
community
this
leaders.
they have other full-time jobs and responsibilities.
Right.
They
Yes.
could be a volunteer board, depending on
Nonprofit
this-
boards or volunteer boards, that's
Yep.
exactly right.
Yep.
For-profit boards, even there, yes, you're involved and engaged, particularly today, more than 20 years ago, more than 30 years ago, much more involved. But you still parachute in.
Yeah,
You're
for
not
sure.
there every single
Right.
day of the
You
week.
may be running your own business.
That's exactly right.
for sure.
And so you try to stay connected as best you can. You know, over my career, I've been on 7 boards. I'm still on 2 publicly traded companies, and I've been deeply involved with the processes that boards go through and the issues and the problems that boards have in overseeing organizations and why they have those issues. And maybe that's something we can talk about next week.
Yes, and the Baldrige, like anything else, also has this opportunity to continuously improve.
Yes.
And what you're describing now is some of those opportunities where you have an incredible framework, an incredible history, great examples of success like you've talked about with Tata and other organizations. But as the economy speeds up, digital technology comes in, competition becomes global, not
just
local.
in-time expectations.
All those kinds
Disruption every other day.
For sure.
Yeah. So kind of to conclude this segment, we often get asked, why would I engage in a Baldrige journey just because of both its comprehensiveness, which implies complexity, as well as its time? And what we often say back is, you can either be reactive as an organization to all of these seismic changes, or you can have a really, really solid structure in every facet of your organization,
Yes.
which gives you agility
Yes.
and being able to be nimble and move the way you want to respond.
Yes, you have to be able to review that entire organization and make the changes you need to make in the face of the disruptions around you, in the face of the digital economy and all the things that are happening to us on a day-out basis. You look at the Fortune 500 years ago, and it was the same companies year after year after year.
Sure.
That's changing now all
right.
the time. And so if you don't fully understand your system, how are you going to optimize the system?
Right.
What we drift into is optimizing each of the subunits on its own. Okay, so you do yours, and Lisa, you do your system, and I'll do my subsystem. But when you do that, you're not optimizing the overall system. The overall organization suffers. If you're doing the best you can, you're doing the best you can, Ben, and I'm doing the best I can. Doesn't mean the organization's doing as well as
Yeah, again, I was at McKesson for almost 20 years, and we were basically a bunch of franchises.
Yes.
We'd been companies that were acquired, and it was survival of the fittest, and whoever performs the best, knock yourself out. And we didn't share those best practices.
So I'll give
that's improved. They've improved.
It's well known in continuous improvement. If you improve a part, it can actually, to the exception of the whole, you can actually be detrimental to it.
Absolutely.
Right. So, for example, in a hospital, if you optimize the emergency department, but you haven't figured out how to accommodate patients in beds, all you're doing is creating borders in the ED.
That's
so
right.
you're not actually helping yourself, and that's kind of a practical example of what you're talking about.
So there's disruption around one of your products in your organization. You're going to have to address that somewhat, but that's going to now perhaps affect the other parts of your organization. If you don't have a handle on this in sort of a systems way, you're not going to make it. You're going to suffer. The disruption will be worse.
So, listeners, stay tuned, because next week we're going to be doing a deep dive on this conversation with Dr. Benson, who is unarguably one of the most insightful and experienced leaders in Baldrige that we know of. So it's a privilege to have him on the show, and we look forward to the discussion next week.
It's good to be with you, Ben. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Ben, and thank you, Lisa, and thank you to Dr. George Benson as well. And thank you to our listeners here on Leader Dialogue, brought to you by Sawyer Vision Group and the Baldrige Foundation. A reminder, you can listen to this show live every Friday at 1 o'clock Eastern Time by visiting BusinessRadioX.com, clicking on the Gwinnett Studio, and then selecting Leader Dialogue. Also, you can enjoy any of our past episodes by visiting LeaderDialogue.com/podcast. On behalf of our hosts, Ben and Lisa, and our special guest, Dr. George Benson, I'm Mike Salmon, and thank you for joining us for Leader Dialogue here on Business Radio X.